What you are about to hear did not come from a journalist. It did not come from a whistleblower hiding in the shadows. It did not come from an opposition party looking for political points. It came from a prince, a man who controls more oil wealth than most nations could dream of, a man who has sat across from world leaders, negotiated trillion-dollar deals and watched governments rise and fall like tides. Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. And 1 hour ago, he looked directly into the camera, directly at Britain, and said words that no one in Westminster was prepared to hear. Words that did not ask questions, words that gave answers. Brutal, documented, undeniable answers. He did not accuse Starmer, he exposed him. There is a difference. An accusation can be denied. An accusation can be spun. An accusation can be buried under press statements and carefully crafted language until the public grows tired and moves on. But what MBS released tonight cannot be denied, cannot be spun, cannot be buried, because it exists in black and white, with signatures, with dates, with names that people inside Number 10 recognise because they wrote them. And right now, as you are watching this, the British government is not holding a press conference. They are not releasing a statement. They are not standing before cameras with calm faces and rehearsed words. They are silent. And that silence is the loudest thing happening in the United Kingdom tonight. Because when a government goes quiet in the middle of a firestorm, it is never because they have nothing to say. It is because they have too much to hide. So before Westminster finds a way to control this story, before the spin doctors rewrite the narrative, before the headlines are softened and the truth is diluted into something manageable and forgettable, you need to hear exactly what happened. Every detail, every document, every second of the moment that may have just ended Keir Starmer's premiership and shaken the British political system to its foundation. Stay with this, because once you understand what MBS revealed tonight, you will never look at British politics the same way again. It began without warning. No leaked intelligence, no whispered rumours circulating through Westminster corridors, no anonymous tip to a journalist buried somewhere in the political press. One moment, the world was moving at its ordinary pace. The next, Saudi state television cut to a live broadcast from Riyadh, and everything changed. Mohammed bin Salman appeared before the cameras in a setting that felt deliberately formal. Deliberate in the way that only powerful men can be deliberate when they know the world is watching. He was calm. That was the first thing people noticed. Not agitated, not accusatory, calm. The kind of calm that does not come from innocence. It comes from certainty, from knowing that what you are about to say cannot be argued with. He spoke slowly, each word placed with surgical care. And then he said the name Keir Starmer, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and the room in Riyadh went utterly still. What followed was not a speech, it was a demolition. MBS announced, with the measured confidence of a man holding a loaded hand, that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia had obtained and verified a series of documents connecting the office of the British Prime Minister directly to a network of European lobbyists operating outside any formal diplomatic channel. These were not rumours dressed up as facts. These were not politically motivated allegations designed to embarrass an adversary. These were documents, official communications, internal memos bearing the letterhead of British government departments, emails traced back to senior advisors sitting inside Number 10 at this very moment. And what those documents described was something the British public had never been told, never been warned about, never been given the opportunity to consent to or reject. According to MBS, Starmer's government had entered into a series of covert understandings with European lobbying groups, understandings that directly touched Britain's energy policy, its defence positioning, and its diplomatic relationship with Gulf allies. The arrangement, as described by the Saudi Crown Prince, was not accidental. It was not the result of miscommunication or bureaucratic oversight. It was deliberate, calculated, hidden, and it had been happening for months beneath the surface of every public statement Starmer had made about transparency, sovereignty, and national interest. The footage was already spreading before the broadcast had finished. Social media absorbed it instantly. Clips of MBS standing before a screen filled with British government seals circulated from London to Washington within minutes. Journalists scrambled. Producers shouted across newsrooms. Political editors, who had been preparing entirely different stories for the evening, suddenly abandoned everything they had built and turned their full attention to what was unfolding out of Riyadh. Inside Westminster, the reaction was immediate and visible. MPs, who had been moving through their ordinary Tuesday rhythms, stopped in corridors. Phones lit up. Whispered conversations turned urgent. And at the centre of it all, behind the famous black door of Number 10 Downing Street, the lights were on. But the silence was absolute. Starmer's communications team locked down. Briefings were cancelled without explanation. Journalists who had scheduled access to senior officials found those appointments vanishing without apology or rescheduling. The machinery of government, which normally operates with at least a performative confidence, had frozen. Not paused, frozen. And the British public, watching their screens, from living rooms and offices and late-night takeaways, began to feel something unfamiliar and deeply unsettling. The feeling that the story they had been told about their government, about their Prime Minister, about the values that had supposedly guided every decision made in their name, might not have been the real story at all. Meanwhile, the documents themselves began to surface online. Fragments at first, screenshots shared faster than any platform could moderate them. Then longer sections, then what appeared to be full chains of correspondence, timestamps intact, department headers visible, the language inside them clipped and urgent in the way that only real communications are. Not the polished prose of official statements, but the hurried, pressured, sometimes careless language of people who believed they were writing in private. One message in particular travelled further than any other. It was short, 7 words that carried the weight of everything MBS had claimed. It read, "The Saudis must not know about Brussels." 7 words, but in those 7 words lived an entire hidden architecture of deception that Starmer's government had apparently constructed and maintained while standing before Parliament and the nation, and speaking about integrity, about law, about the moral clarity that had been the foundation of his political identity from the moment he entered public life. That identity was now on fire, and the fire had been lit in Riyadh. The documents did not arrive all at once. That was what made it so devastating. MBS understood something that the British political establishment had apparently forgotten, that exposure delivered in a single moment allows governments to absorb the impact, compose themselves, and begin the work of containment. But exposure delivered in waves, one revelation followed by another, that is something entirely different. That dismantles the ability to respond, because by the time a government recovers from the first strike, the second has already landed. And before they can process that, the third arrives. It is not journalism. It is not politics. It is strategy. And MBS executed it with a precision that left Westminster with no ground to stand on. The second release came 90 minutes after the initial broadcast. This time, it was not emails. It was trade memos. Confidential internal documents from within the British Energy Department. Documents that described in specific and technical language how Starmer's ministers had made deliberate adjustments to oil tariff compliance structures in ways that benefited European buyers, while effectively undercutting Saudi export interests. In plain terms, the British government had been giving with one hand to Gulf allies in public, while quietly taking away with the other in private. The financial implications were immediate. Oil futures spiked within the hour. The pound, already nervous from the initial broadcast, fell again, harder this time. Trading desks in London and New York scrambled to interpret what they were seeing. Because this was no longer just a political story. This was a story about money, about the agreements that govern the flow of energy across continents, about whether Britain could be trusted as a partner in the deals that keep economies functioning. And the answer those markets were delivering in real time was deeply uncomfortable. Investors do not panic because of scandal. They panic because of uncertainty. And what MBS had created in the space of a few hours was total uncertainty about the reliability of British government commitments, about whether the agreements made in public reflected the reality of what was happening in private, about whether any future deal with Britain could be trusted to mean what it appeared to mean on the surface. While the markets bled, the political fallout inside Westminster accelerated. Opposition MPs who had spent weeks waiting for an opportunity to put serious pressure on Starmer suddenly found themselves holding more ammunition than they had dared to hope for. Emergency hearings were demanded. Questions were tabled. Parliamentary procedures that can move with glacial slowness under normal circumstances were being invoked with a speed that reflected genuine panic in the ranks of those trying to manage the situation. And inside the Labour Party itself, the silence was beginning to fracture. Insiders who had maintained absolute loyalty through months of difficult news cycles found themselves unable to defend something they could not explain. One source, speaking without attribution to a major broadcaster, described the atmosphere inside the Parliamentary Labour Party that evening as unlike anything experienced in years. Not angry, not defiant. Something quieter and more dangerous than that. The word used was lost. People felt lost because the story that had sustained their belief in what they were doing, the story of a Prime Minister defined by his commitment to law and accountability, was collapsing under the weight of evidence they had not expected and could not dismiss. The British public watched all of this in real time. Social media had become a parallel parliament, faster, louder, and far less controlled than the institution on the Thames. Hashtags exploded, comment sections filled with a mixture of fury, disbelief, and the kind of dark humour that the British deploy when the scale of a disaster becomes too large for straightforward emotion to contain. But beneath the humour, beneath the noise, something genuine was moving through the country. A slow-spreading realisation that the gap between what they had been told and what had actually been happening might be far wider than anyone had acknowledged. A former senior diplomat, speaking to one broadcaster, described the situation in terms that cut through every layer of political packaging. He said, "When a foreign government has better documentation of your domestic policy decisions than your own parliament does, you have a problem that goes beyond any individual scandal." That sentence travelled because it was true, and because it named something that people were beginning to feel but had not yet found the language to articulate. Britain's secrets were apparently safer in Riyadh than they were in Westminster, and MBS was not finished yet. By the time night fell over London, the city felt different. There is a quality to political crisis that people who have lived through them describe in remarkably similar terms. A texture to the air, a heaviness in ordinary spaces. Coffee shops where people stare at their phones without speaking. Tube carriages where strangers make eye contact in that wordless way that acknowledges shared anxiety without naming it. London had that quality tonight, the kind of collective unease that settles over a city when the story it has been telling itself about the people who govern it begins to visibly unravel. Westminster was a different category of chaos entirely. By 8 o'clock in the evening, the area around Parliament had become a gathering point for people who had nowhere else to take what they were feeling. The crowds were not organised. There had been no call to march, no coordinated protest movement sending out alerts. People had simply arrived individually, then in small groups, then in numbers that required the Metropolitan Police to begin repositioning resources and quietly establishing barriers that had not been there an hour before. The signs were handwritten, some angry, some despairing, some asking questions that had no comfortable answer. And among the crowd, a mood that was harder to define than simple anger, something closer to grief. The grief of people who had believed in something and were watching that belief be taken apart in front of them on a Tuesday evening in November. Inside Number 10, the situation that sources described was one of almost complete institutional paralysis. Starmer had been in private meetings since the early afternoon. Senior advisors rotated in and out of his office. The cabinet, normally a body whose members maintain at least a performance of collective unity in moments of difficulty, had become something closer to a collection of individuals making separate calculations about their own positions. Chancellor Rachel Reeves had reportedly declined to attend a scheduled evening meeting at Downing Street. Her office, contacted by multiple journalists, released no statement and took no calls. In the language of political crisis management, that kind of absence communicates everything that an absence is designed to communicate. She was distancing. And when a chancellor distances from a prime minister in the middle of a crisis, the question of how much longer that prime minister can function is no longer theoretical. The third wave of Saudi releases arrived at precisely 9:15. Again, the timing felt deliberate. MBS, or those acting on his behalf, clearly understood the rhythms of British media, knew exactly when the evening news cycles would be at their most receptive, and timed each delivery to land with maximum impact inside those windows. This release was audio, a recording, partially degraded but substantially audible, of what appeared to be a telephone conversation between a senior British government official and a counterpart in Brussels. The content of that conversation, if genuine, described explicit awareness at senior levels of the government that the communications with European lobbyists fell outside the oversight frameworks that Parliament had established. Not accidental, not bureaucratic confusion. Aware, deliberate, conscious of the fact that what was being done would not survive scrutiny if it were brought into the light. The British public heard that recording on television, on radio, and on their phones simultaneously. And the reaction across the country was not primarily political, it was personal. Because the voice in that recording, whoever it belonged to, was not speaking in the abstract language of policy. It was speaking the way people speak when they believe no one outside their small circle will ever hear what they are saying. It was the voice of someone who had decided that ordinary people could be managed, that the public could be told one thing, while something else entirely was being arranged on their behalf, that sovereignty and accountability were words for speeches rather than principles for governance. That voice landed like a physical blow. Senior Labour figures who had been attempting to manage the story through carefully measured public statements went quiet. One MP, a figure who had been among Starmer's most visible defenders throughout his leadership, appeared on a major broadcaster and for the first time did not defend the Prime Minister. He deflected. He spoke about process and inquiry and the importance of allowing facts to be established through proper channels. And in the gap between what he said and what he did not say, every viewer heard the resignation that was still hours away from becoming official. Inside the Palace of Westminster, the constitutional machinery began to move. Procedures that exist precisely for moments when confidence in a government collapses. Procedures that are rarely invoked because rarely does the erosion of trust happen this fast were being discussed in terms that made clear this was no longer a question of political management. This was a question of survival. Dawn arrived over a capital that had not properly slept. The Thames carried the same grey light it always does on winter mornings, indifferent to the wreckage on its banks. But Westminster was not the Westminster that had existed 48 hours earlier. Something had broken, not bent, not strained, broken. And when things break at the level of institutional trust, at the level of the basic compact between a government and the people it governs, the damage does not repair itself through press conferences and carefully managed apologies. The damage becomes the story permanently. And permanently is the word that hung over Downing Street that morning, like something physical. The final Saudi release came before sunrise. Saudi state television aired it without announcement, without preamble, without the contextual framing that even the most aggressive journalism provides. Just footage, high-definition footage of British government documents laid flat under lights, each page filmed in sequence, each signature and departmental stamp clearly visible. The final page bore his initials, not attributed, not alleged, his initials on a document that described a private commitment made to a European lobbying network during a period when the Prime Minister had been publicly committed to what he described as transparent, sovereignty-respecting, national interest-first diplomacy. MBS did not speak during the broadcast. He did not need to. His silence was the verdict, and the entire world understood it as such. British broadcasters erupted. Sky News went live immediately. The BBC, normally cautious to the point of institutional hesitation in moments of political crisis, ran the story with a directness that reflected the impossibility of equivocation. The Guardian's front page went live digitally before the physical edition could be printed. One word in red, exposed, and that word said everything that 12 hours of careful journalistic language had been attempting to say without quite reaching. At 10 that morning, Buckingham Palace released a statement. It was short, fewer than 50 words. It spoke of accountability and integrity in public service, in language that was chosen to remain technically neutral, while being emotionally and politically unambiguous to anyone who read it with clear eyes. The monarch had weighed in, not loudly, not with the kind of direct intervention that constitutional conventions would not permit.